Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new Redefining Security podcast. Have you ever thought that we are selling cybersecurity insincerely, buying it indiscriminately, and deploying it ineffectively? Perhaps we are. So let's look at how we can organize a successful InfoSec program that integrates people, process, technology, and culture to drive growth and protect business value. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Pantera, the leader in automation security validation, allows organizations to continuously test the integrity of all cybersecurity layers by emulating real-world attacks at scale to pinpoint the exploitable vulnerabilities and prioritize remediation towards business impact. Learn more at www.pantera.io.
EdgeScan offers continuous vulnerability intelligence as a service, accurately identifying vulnerabilities and exposures across the full stack. All threats are verified by cybersecurity experts, providing exploitable risk and remediation guidance, virtually false positive free. Learn more at edgescan.com.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me here. You're very welcome on a new Redefining Cybersecurity podcast here on ITSP Magazine. I'm actually joined today by my co-founder, Marco. We're going to have a good conversation looking at the role of cybersecurity in business and how different aspects of things in the public sector and in the legal space can help shape the security program in a different way that maybe you aren't thinking. And we have a great guest on, Marco, and Andy Purdy. He's the CSO for Huawei Technologies. Andy, thanks for being on.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Sean. It's going to be a great story. I can't wait to learn more.
So, Andy, you were starting to share with us kind of your background. Can you give us a view into what you've done in the public sector and in the legal space leading up to your role? Sure.
Well, I have a lengthy legal career that included roles as a federal prosecutor, congressional investigator, investigating the Kennedy assassination, special counsel to the House Ethics Committee, counsel to the Senate Impeachment Trial Committee. And then my work with the United States Sentencing Commission involved both individual crimes that could relate to technology and cybersecurity, of course, as well as corporate offenses. And so it was the effort to try to find more information about what is important about different aspects of cyber criminality that should be considered by judges in determining what the sentence should be for individual criminals. The concept was individuals who commit similar crimes should face similar sentences. But that was together with my work in terms of corporate compliance under the sentencing guidelines, where organizations would get significant benefits in criminal prosecutions for misconduct of employees if they put in place strong internal compliance programs. So it's interesting that compliance, which is sort of a dirty word in cybersecurity because risk is the focus, is in fact an important aspect of this. So the work that I was doing to try to understand individual cyber crimes led me to organize a conference on behalf of the Sentencing Commission, brought together a number of major cybersecurity leaders, including the late Howard Schmidt. And after President Bush formed the effort to launch the U.S. national strategy to secure cyberspace, Howard Schmidt called me up and asked me to come join the White House staff to work on that strategy. So that was early 2002. So 20 years later, I'm still in cybersecurity. The last 10, I've been involved with Huawei with a number of interesting roles in between. But I was recruited to join Huawei by John Suffolk, who's still our global Chief Security and Privacy Officer. I'm in charge of the USA Cybersecurity and Privacy. The idea was, and has continued to be, to try to promote a safer cyberspace and try to promote an effective internal program of risk governance and risk management regarding cybersecurity and privacy. And so our organizing a global platform for governance for cybersecurity and privacy for our company, then with similar kinds of operations within the United States, for example, where you would have individuals in the different components that are relevant to cybersecurity and privacy, which could be IT, legal, human relations, training people, and more technical people in sales and meeting standards and regulatory requirements, meeting customer requirements, would all be part of a committee. And we have a global committee where you have the president of one of our global organizations, consumer, carrier, enterprise, would all be on this global committee. And their job is to maintain a global risk governance process where the requirements are developed by experts, the requirements are communicated, and their internal systems such as self-checks and audits to make sure the individual responsibilities are being met. So it might be requirements to train your average person once or twice a year. It might be special requirements to train your technical people more often. Technical people need to have certain certification, certain requirements for the protection of data consistent with the particular country in which we're doing business, and the particular requirements of customers. So a combination of risk management and compliance, where you are continually evolving what your requirements are. It's to be consistent with your business objectives and your risk environment, but you have systems in place so that the bosses who don't need to be experts have some capability to know whether you're doing what you need to do to manage risk, to meet the requirements of our customers, to meet the requirements of governments in the countries in which we do business.
It's a mouthful, Andy, and it generates a ton of questions for me. Let me start here.
Well, if you have a difficult question, we'll be out of time. So
That's right. Let me see. I'll try to pile 2 or 3 on at once. Now, I'm just thinking how what you just described might look, or how it might look differently in other organizations, because I have conversations with others where we talk about application security, and there's a dedicated AppSec team that kind of partners up with the DevOps team, and maybe an IT kind of sits in the middle to kind of make sure that all operates properly. And that's kind of its own little faction, its own little committee. And then I've had conversations where HR and security build a relationship, or HR or legal and security build a relationship. But I've not heard a global committee be formed. And I'm just wondering, do those other roles, does the AppSec team still exist in the committee view, or how does that look?
Well, you have the details at the operational level. Certain details are global. So, for example, on the U.S. committee and on the global committee, in the case of the global committee, the president of our global consumer business is on the committee, the president of our enterprise business, the president of our network business. And so they have certain requirements within their responsibility. So, for example, certain products require common criteria. Certain devices require, in the U.S., you'd have to be tested for RF for your mobile devices. And so you've got a lot of different standards around the world that the different business groups and the different departments and sections within the business groups have to identify what are the standards, what are the best practices, what needs to be done. So they populate the requirements at a global level, and then within individual regions and individual countries like the EU, you have to understand what are the particular requirements in that area. And so that's why, for example, for privacy, the company has basically tried to follow the European Union GDPR, their general rule on data privacy, as a company generally. So we don't have to do any more instances of many different things all over the world, that you can have as much commonality as you can. And then certain places you might have a higher risk requirement. So all the kinds of things you're thinking of, just that we're a large company, we're in 170 countries. And so we have to make sure that the requirements of the regulatory bodies, of the customers, and we have our own requirements to provide some consistency in terms of cybersecurity and privacy. So then we also have, in addition to that, so you've got all those requirements, and there has to be verification that go up the chain, kind of a red, yellow, green kind of thing as to whether the requirements are being met. But we also have like a separate business unit, the internal cybersecurity lab, that does testing of the products for vulnerabilities. And so we pay for, hire experts, tools to look for, because of course no single tool can find all the vulnerabilities, to look for the vulnerabilities. And when there are problems, it goes back to the people whose job it is to meet the requirements, and their internal KPIs have to be key performance indicators, have to be married up with their departments, with the business group, and so forth, so that if something gets bumped back from our internal cybersecurity lab, they've got to fix it the first time. Or if the problem occurs again, they're going to hit problems. So you're creating that internal self-check, that internal audits, and we have the 9,000 audits in certain business experiences, certain companies, certain customers would require certain kinds of audits. So it's a complicated thing, but I think it's one that we've had great success with, and our challenges are the same as any big company, the same as any company in whatever the business group is, and we have the larger global challenges of which you're aware. So promoting a safer cyberspace, more accountability, more transparency, which we continue to advocate for, is at the heart of what we're trying to do.
So it sounds to me you're running a country, almost like a government form, where there is a lot of check and balance and coordinate, and then there is also the feedback that comes maybe from the business, from every line of product development and so forth. I mean, it sounds like very complex. I'm not kidding by saying that. I'm wondering, maybe your past as working at the White House coming into place in putting this.
Well, and then when I worked at Homeland Security, where I was in charge of National Cybersecurity Division and U.S. CERT for 2 years, and I was the DHS representative of the Committee on National Security Systems. So, I had some perspective. And it's interesting you mentioned governments, because the notion of accountability, for example, in the United States government, hopefully President Biden's executive order from about a year ago, hopefully there will be a greater emphasis on having accountability for major leaders within government agencies to meet cybersecurity and privacy requirements, and to communicate if their budgets don't have the adequate resources to meet the requirements. Because to some extent, it's kind of like, oh, you got to meet OMB requirements, and then, NIST is doing a great job to come up with the standards. But there really hasn't been accountability of the government leaders, like OPM breach from some years ago. It hasn't really said, okay, the leaders of the agencies, the leaders of the department, you got to push responsibility down, but you've got to make, and that's the beauty of our system. And God knows it's not perfect, and we're open to communicating more and more about what we do and how we do it and why, and get guidance from other folks. But, our system, it's up to the head of the consumer division to make sure that the people down the line throughout the world are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that they're rewarded. The departments are rewarded when they meet the requirements, and they're disincentivized when they're not. So your bonus, your rewards, your salaries, your promotion are all tied into doing what you're supposed to be doing. And by having independent checks, separation of duties concept, which I'm sure you're familiar with, you make sure the people that are supposed to do it are different than the people who are going to evaluate whether you do it. And that way you have some ability to tell who's accountable. But it's not simply a question of saying, for example, oh, we need a cybersecurity expert on the board of directors, which seems to be a frequent conversation. That's not what it's about. It's about making sure that folks understand what their responsibilities are, and they're going to be held accountable for it in a consequential way.
I actually find it really fascinating, this correlation and between how the government run and how the business run, and how they both kind of can learn from each other. It's still a business, even if you're running a country. It's still technically, a business of running the country. So, Sean, I think this is leading to the business of security. I'm just inviting you here. I'm opening the door for you.
Yeah, because you touched on it earlier, Andy. Just the communications, and you don't need the cybersecurity expert on the board or in the executive staff. But you have this committee that sounds like I'm so oversimplifying, I'm sure, translating between the business and the compliance / risk / controls that are required. How do you see that happening? What's your role specifically in making sure that happens?
Well, in each country, as I said, we have a committee that does that kind of work within the country. So making sure that we are following the requirements. For example, if we have a contract, and this is a little more in the past than in the future, but if we have a contract where we've sold equipment and then we might service the equipment, that making sure that we are following the requirements for accessing the customer's network or system pursuant to the agreed upon rules. So, for example, if the customer were to say, okay, here's the password for you guys, so whoever men or women are servicing it, they will use this password. No, that's a non-starter for us. It may be easier for the customer to have only one password, but we need the separate login credentials for each individual. And that's part of our responsibility, of course, if an employee leaves or responsibilities change, those privileges have to be stripped away. They have to be changed. They have to be taken back. And so sometimes that takes a little more effort. It costs a little more money. And so when there are major problems, we would be communicating up. And that's the bottom line, is those issues that aren't resolved consistent with what's been agreed to need to get escalated. Those situations where, maybe a company's had a major data breach, and so, they need to hire some outside investigators, maybe they've got to pay something. So there needs to be some decision making. And if certain things change, and then certain resources are necessary to have more people to meet the requirements, not just in terms of doing the business, but from the cybersecurity and privacy perspective, that has to be escalated to a higher level for the decision makers. And they own the risk, just as they own the risk in everything in the organization. And if they decided, well, we don't want to spend the money on X, Y, or Z, then that's the decision. But we who are teeing that up, of course, companies around the world, we have to make clear, this is the consequence, here's the choice, here's what you do, here's what best practices are, or here's what the standard is. And if you're going to do this, you're going to be outside of the mainstream of what you're supposed to do. And it's on you. You have to take the responsibility.
And this may seem like a silly question as well, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The budget to do what you do, and the global organization do what it does. There's a point where it just doesn't make sense to put more money into mitigating risk and implementing controls and then auditing all that stuff and reporting on it. And I'm just wondering, is the budget set and you kind of manipulate the risk within the budget, or do you find that it's regular, we've exceeded the risk level, we need more budget, even though we had a set amount previously?
Well, it's really communication, and it's continuous learning, it's continuous improvement. So if the risk environment changes, or there's some change in business objectives which affect the risk environment, if there's an impact on the resources, that has to be communicated up the chain, so they can decide, are they going to accept the risk, or they're not going to provide the additional resources. Obviously, nobody has unlimited funds, and we spend an awful lot, like large companies do, to meet these requirements. And kind of the evolution. So, for example, a major evolution now that many companies around the world are doing is toward a zero trust concept. And that's very important, to make sure that you have the funding, you have the technical capabilities to have that kind of continuous validation of just about everything, so that you can manage the risk appropriately.
I'd like to kind of keep on this, but also talk about scalability. Like you mentioned change, and you have a very complex machine that sounds like it's working very well. Is that something that you think is unique to a multinational company like IUA or other multinational company, or is a model for cybersecurity that could be scaled down to any other size company?
Well, I think the idea is that regardless of the size of your organization, whether it's governmental or private, there needs to be some kind of an enterprise-wide capability to manage risk and to articulate and develop and over time improve the requirements, understanding the threats, the vulnerabilities and consequences, understanding the business objectives, and need to push down of the different components of those who contribute to managing that risk. And most of it's generated by them. Here's what the requirements are. Here are the best practices. Maybe we hire an outside consultant to recommend we use this standard or that standard, or this process, or maybe this kind of a role we're not going to play because the risk is too great. It can't be managed effectively. So I think any organization needs some kind of an enterprise-wide, risk management. You see, for example, in the session, coincidentally, that NIST is taking at the time of recording this, NIST Cybersecurity Framework Conference to develop a Framework 2.0. They're talking about the fact, of course, that there are special resources they call profiles or even small businesses, they can access this information that's available on the NIST website, so they can see how they can manage risk when you have relatively little people and relatively little expertise. But what are the kinds of basic things they need to know, some of which maybe they can contract out, and they've got profiles for manufacturing and I think financial services and many others that can give very good guidance to a company. But sometimes, frankly, in the discussions and conferences and sessions and exhibitions around the world, it seems like maybe it's just a question of focus, and maybe it's just assumed, but the idea of having an enterprise-wide, the leadership of the company has to have some mechanism to manage risk and to know what the requirements are, to know whether it's being followed, and to allocate or make decisions about allocating resources appropriately. To me, that's a given.
Boy, so many directions to go here. Let me ask this. How involved are you and these committees in, I guess a lot of conversations I have, I'm going to back up a little bit. A lot of conversations I have, it's security comes in and kind of plugs the holes, reports on where the current risk is, and tries to help mitigate what's already been built. AppSec tries to help maybe shift some of those things left, but I think generally on the broader operational view, security is kind of left to pick up the pieces after the fact. And I was wondering how involved are you in deciding or helping to determine this is the strategy we're going to take from a business perspective. These are the types of systems we're going to use, the way we're going to architect it, the types of data we're going to create, collect, store, share, whatever, and perhaps reduce some exposure before it even becomes a problem for security to then have to mitigate that exposure.
Well, I certainly don't think of it as picking up the pieces. I think the culture that I think we've developed over time has been that, let's say you're talking about a new business opportunity and new products. So right now, we've created specialized teams, for example, in ports, for the automation of ports. And so the security is part of that. So it's not a question of they do whatever the hell they want and then you bring in the security people. It's like the considerations of cybersecurity and privacy are part of the development of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And the articulation of requirements is not led by us, but we help inform what those are and help inform the ability to assess them, to do self-checks and other kinds of informal or formal audits to meet those requirements. But also part of it is, in terms of when you talk about picking up the pieces, kind of implies an incident or some kind of a response. So we work closely with the business groups of course, and most companies do this. So I'm not saying, we're special in this, work together to understand, okay, here are the crisis management, here are the incident response capabilities. So making sure there's training and tabletop exercises. Okay. And the business, of course, is saying, well, this is kind of bad stuff that could happen. We've seen it in other companies, maybe not publicized, maybe publicized. And so the idea of, okay, when something happens, setting up the crisis team is usually led by the business to figure out what happened, where did it happen, how serious it is, knowing exactly when to work with the customers to make sure, that they've got to be really managing it, to make sure the legal requirements for reporting are being met by the customer, and to the extent we have such requirements are being met by us. And so that training, and also, of course, the after action, that when some stuff hits the fan, talking about, okay, this is what happened, investigating the cause of what happened, and looking at how we respond, but also looking at what else could have happened. Maybe something really big almost happened. So looking at what came close to happening and then coming up and reporting up to management. This is what happened. This is the lessons learned. This is what we need to do different. Here's how we need to change the processes. So it really is very much of a team approach. And, it's a continuous kind of thing where you're trying to improve, trying to learn lessons because, bad stuff happens.
So continuous learning, continuous improvement. How much do you look at from either a planning and investment perspective to say, this is the direction of technology, this is the direction of the market, this is the direction of government and policy, and in order, like ESG, for example, is a big topic. These are big things that are moving that don't impact us today, but we have to prepare for to ensure that our organization stays resilient, that our committee stays resilient, that our security teams stay resilient? How do you balance that?
Well, it's a tricky thing, of course. I mean, I think invested $22 billion in research and development last year, in the top 5 in the world. And part of that is, as we're developing new technologies, trying to develop greater capabilities using, for example, of course, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, to try to have greater abilities to identify risk in advance, to detect concerning activities. Of course, you've seen a lot of the publicity in the U.S. government trying to increase the sharing of information among organizations where something may not obviously be of broader concern, but to start sharing sooner, because if somebody connects the dots, you might realize that little thing is of greater concern. And so that's why we participate in information sharing with the various certs around the world and so forth. But trying to improve the capabilities for prevention, for detecting, for isolating and mitigating, minimizing the effect of the damage, because the bad guys are going to get in, bad stuff's going to happen, but trying to mitigate the damage from it, and learn from the little things so you can help prevent the big things.
I guess I'm going to keep going with my pendulum. First, I brought you on the smaller scale. Now I'm going to bring you on the bigger scale, which is, of course, your company works with a ton of government. You're in the communication business, so a lot of policy, a lot of balancing and politics, I would say. The importance of collaboration at a global level for cybersecurity in the interest of each country. I don't know, I'm being idealistic here, but this is just who I am. Where are we going? Are we on a good point? Is there more we can do? What's your view on that?
Well, it's an exciting time, and frankly, it's been pretty exciting for quite a while. Maybe it'd be good if it was a little less exciting,
right?
But some of the cyber attacks that have taken place, and some of them are almost 2 years ago now. SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange Server, for example, reminding us of the capabilities of malicious cyber actors, what they can do without us being able to quickly identify what they do. Refreshing the fact that we have to assume that they're going to get in, and in fact they are in. And frankly, and this gets a little bit to what you were just talking about, is I think there's a growing recognition that the concept of trusted suppliers may go by the wayside, because if by that you mean you do less scrutiny of what they do and how they do it, I would suggest that I think that's a mistake, because the bad guys can hack into the good guys. And so if they hack into the good guys and they're proceeding throughout their systems and networks and those they interact with, they then have the ability to do, national security level intelligence gathering, to launch disruptive attacks, to steal data and send it someplace else. And so that's part of why the zero trust is so important, because obviously the idea of a perimeter in cybersecurity is long good. But since President Biden's executive order in 2021, there's been a greater, more widespread recognition of the importance of zero trust. And I think that's a very good thing. I think you see the work after some of these cyber attacks of the European Union, for example, and obviously Germany, part of the European Union, the work they've been doing to try to understand the 5G and beyond threat landscapes and how to detect better, how to evaluate products. I know I saw something a month or two ago that Nokia put out, where somebody was accusing them of stealing data or sending it back. And they put out a statement, which I certainly could relate to, where they said, well, they don't have the ability to do that. They sell the products, the carriers control it. And, they don't own that anymore. And, to that, I say, that's a perfect example of something that we certainly believe that's true. But if somebody believes that's not true, whether it's us or Nokia or our competitors or whatever, then somebody needs to investigate and do some real work to find out. Because if those assumptions are wrong, we need to make greater measures to be able to find out if this bad stuff is happening or can happen. And frankly, when we look at something like, and we won't have time to go into privacy much today, but you see the discussions 2 years ago about TikTok and WeChat, the discussions this year about WeChat. And 2 years ago, the focus was really on ownership and control, which is a typical approach the U.S. government understandably takes to things. Now, in the recent New York Times article about WeChat, about TikTok, it sounds like, and I don't know if this is true, but it sounds like they're negotiating with the U.S. government for a possible national security agreement, which is the idea of putting in risk mitigation measures overseen by the U.S. government to make sure the data, which was one of the major issues of the WeChat situation, the data is not going to anybody it's not supposed to go to, whether it's to China or anybody else. So ownership and control is fine, but we need to have some idea and hopefully some greater ability to audit companies. And, we're happy to participate in that, to find out whether the privacy data protection policies are not being followed. Because we want to find that stuff out before there's a giant data breach or before we find out if all this bad stuff has happened. And I've heard some reports the U.S. government's not sure if the data has been sent back or whatever. Well, we need greater ability to know and to hold accountable companies and organizations, whether it's social media platforms and whatever, that have so much data. If we really care about privacy, we're going to do a whole lot more than we've been doing in this country.
Yeah, and talk about sustainability. I mean, if there's a serious issue there, it's not that an organization isn't going to survive for very long, right? So, and perhaps, I don't know, maybe markets change and things change because of that at a broader scale.
Well, some of the big data breaches, you see the stock plummet, and then eventually the stock comes back, and then the company's okay. So, but if there are government sanctions because of something, that's why the European Union is so skeptical of coming up with a new privacy shield provisions.
Right. Yeah, and the whole sovereign cloud. I mean, there's a lot of fun stuff to talk about there. As we wrap, Andy, maybe just a final thought from you. It's another thing I'd like to explore a bit is the concept of defining and measuring success. So maybe from the committee's perspective, how do they know that their efforts are making a difference?
Well, I think the process, the combination of things like, are we being certified to the standards we're supposed to be certified to for different products and services? Are the self-checks producing the kind of demonstrated evidence that the people are doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are the audits that are done showing compliance? Are the evaluations by our independent cybersecurity lab, are the problems being identified and fixed? The feedback from our customers showing that we are successfully, with them of course, successfully meeting the regulatory requirements, the contractual requirements, because we get burned financially if we don't meet those requirements. If we do really bad stuff, it's going to hurt our reputation, and our ability to do business is going to be devastated. So this would all have a terrible, terrible impact. I think part of the reality, and this cybersecurity framework workshop is talking about this, the metrics about success is tricky, but metrics that are saying, okay, what is the risk profile of a company? And where do they need to go to a better risk profile given their business objectives? And so what needs to happen? And are those things being happening along the way, so that there's some kind of accountability? And that's something that you can facilitate with contractual requirements, maybe disclosure requirements with government. You certainly want to minimize prescriptive regulations by government, because I don't think that helps facilitate the kind of risk management that can be most effective.
The reason I ask that question is oftentimes I hear the MTTX, right? Time to respond, time to recover, time to detect, all those types of things. Certainly it's from a SOC perspective, response perspective, but I don't know. And vulnerability management is another area that we tend to wrap metrics around. And it seems like just by being busy, we think we're being successful. And I think there are other ways too. I like how you use the checks and balances, right? Are we defining the audits or the things we need to care about in a certain way, and are the audits producing the results and response? So it's the challenge response aspect of that.
I think some of the supply chain work that NIST and CISA and others around the world have been doing has been very, very important. And transparency is a critical part of that. And I think the global community and in the US, we need to find what kinds of transparency can companies like us or other companies make available to regulators or customers, so they can tell before bad things happen that the requirements are being met. The software bill of materials idea, that I was part of that group at NIST that helped develop it prior to the it being referenced significantly in the president's executive order. Something like the software bill of materials is very, very important. So it gives customers a greater ability and government stakeholders a greater ability to know what's the stuff, what is the software that's in our systems, and then the vulnerabilities. It makes vulnerability management. If you have machine readable software bill of materials, it can help address the risk much more quickly. So these are a combination of things that can help, but trying to have collaboration on R&D, how can there be greater transparency? How can there be greater capabilities to know if the risk is greater than we think it is?
I love it. And I could talk to you for hours, I think, Andy, but I don't want to get in the way of a dinner that is coming at some point. So I think we'll wrap here with a thank you from me, and I'm sure Marco enjoyed this as well. Great insight, and good to get your perspective coming from the different angles that you've come from through to your role there at Huawei. So
you're
thanks,
very
Andy.
welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Take care.
EdgeScan offers continuous vulnerability intelligence as a service, accurately identifying vulnerabilities and exposures across the full stack. All threats are verified by cybersecurity experts, providing exploitable risk and remediation guidance, virtually false positive free. Learn more at edgescan.com.
Pentera, the leader in automation security validation, allows organizations to continuously test the integrity of all cybersecurity layers by emulating real-world attacks at scale to pinpoint the exploitable vulnerabilities and prioritize remediation towards business impact. Learn more at www.pentera.io.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Redefining Security podcast. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.